The morning sun painted the cliffs gold as Thomas packed his climbing gear. At 32, he had been scaling rock faces for over 12 years, but there was something special about today's climb. The remote section of the Cascade Mountains had called to him ever since his friend Lee mentioned it last month. Not many climbers ventured to this particular cliff. It was far from the usual trails, required a tough 3-hour hike just to reach the base, and had routes that weren't well documented. That was exactly why Thomas wanted to go. "You sure about this?" his girlfriend Casey asked, handing him an extra water bottle. "That area doesn't even have proper cell coverage." Thomas smiled as he tucked the bottle into his pack. "That's half the appeal. Besides, I've got the satellite phone if anything goes wrong." Casey shook her head, but there was affection in her eyes. She had long ago accepted that Thomas needed these challenges like other people needed air. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 2 hours, with the last 30 minutes on a rough dirt road that made Thomas grateful for his truck's suspension. As he hiked toward the cliff, the morning fog still clung to the valley below, giving the landscape a dreamlike quality. Pine trees stood like sentinels along the path, and the only sounds were his footsteps and the occasional call of a bird. By the time Thomas reached the base of the cliff, the sun had burned away most of the mist. He stood looking up at the rock face, mentally mapping the route he would take. The cliff wasn't the tallest he had ever climbed, perhaps 400 feet at its highest point, but its surface offered a beautiful complexity of challenges. Smooth sections gave way to jagged outcroppings. Narrow cracks promised good handholds in some areas, while other parts would require real technical skill to navigate. Thomas took his time gearing up. He checked his harness twice, tested his ropes, and made sure all his carabiners were locked. Safety had become second nature after years of climbing, but he never rushed this part. Too many good climbers had been injured or worse because they got careless with their equipment checks. The first 100 feet went smoothly. Thomas found a good rhythm, his hands finding natural holds in the rock face as he worked his way upward. The physical exertion felt good, clearing his mind of everything except the next move, the next handhold. This was why he climbed, for these moments when nothing existed except him and the rock. About halfway up, Thomas paused on a small ledge to catch his breath and drink some water. From this height, he could see for miles: the sprawling forest, a silver ribbon of river in the distance, and the jagged peaks of mountains beyond. The world looked different from up here, more peaceful somehow. After a short rest, he continued his ascent. The next section was trickier, with fewer obvious handholds. Thomas moved carefully, testing each new grip before putting his full weight on it. He was about 200 feet up when something strange caught his attention. As Thomas reached for what looked like a promising handhold, his fingers brushed against a section of rock that felt unusually smooth, almost artificially so. He paused, bracing himself with his left hand while his right explored the area. At first he thought it might be some kind of mineral deposit that had weathered differently from the surrounding stone. But as his fingers traced the edges, he realized there was a pattern to the smoothness. It formed straight lines, too perfect to be natural. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered to himself. Curious now, he shifted his position to get a better look. The section was partially covered by a thick growth of moss and lichen, which explained why it wasn't immediately visible. Thomas carefully brushed away some of the vegetation, revealing what appeared to be geometric lines cut into the rock face. His heart beat faster as he cleared more of the growth away. The lines formed a rectangle about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It was unmistakable. This was some kind of door or hatch embedded in the cliff face. Thomas hovered there for several minutes, suspended nearly 200 feet above the ground, staring at his discovery in disbelief. Who would put a door in the side of a mountain, especially one that was so difficult to access? And why? He examined the edges more closely. The door was made of metal, not rock, though years of exposure had left it weathered to nearly the same color as the surrounding cliff. Around its edges, he could make out what looked like a sealing mechanism, designed to keep the elements out. But what really caught his attention were the symbols etched into the surface, not words or letters he recognized, but definitely intentional markings. Thomas pulled out his phone to take pictures, only to remember he had no signal here. He took the photos anyway, knowing he could examine them later. The discovery had sent his mind racing with possibilities. Was this some old mining operation? A military installation? Something else entirely? He tried to see if there was a way to open the door but found no obvious handle or latch. The seam around the edges was tight. Whoever had built this had meant for it to stay closed. Thomas pressed against it experimentally, but it didn't budge. The sun had moved across the sky, and Thomas realized he'd been examining the door for nearly an hour. He needed to make a decision: continue his climb to the top as planned, or rappel down and come back another day with better equipment to investigate this strange find. His curiosity was on fire, but Thomas was experienced enough to know his limitations. He didn't have the tools to safely explore this door today, and attempting to force it open while dangling from a rope hundreds of feet up wasn't smart. This would require proper planning. Thomas marked the location carefully in his mind, noting distinctive features in the rock face that would help him find this exact spot again. Then he took more photos from different angles, making sure to capture the surrounding area as well as close-ups of the door and its mysterious symbols. The rest of his climb was mechanical, his mind no longer present in the rhythm of the ascent, but instead swirling with questions about what he had found. When he finally reached the top of the cliff, Thomas sat on a boulder and pulled out his water bottle, staring out at the view without really seeing it. The door didn't make sense. This area was remote, difficult to access, and as far as Thomas knew, had never been developed or used for any kind of industrial purpose. The park ranger he'd spoken with last week had mentioned only that the area had been briefly surveyed for mining potential in the early 1900s, but nothing had come of it. Yet someone had gone to extraordinary effort to create that door, embedding it so perfectly into the cliff face that it was nearly invisible unless you were right on top of it. And those symbols, they didn't look like any kind of industrial markings he was familiar with. Thomas pulled out his phone again and scrolled through the photos he'd taken. The images confirmed he hadn't imagined it. There was definitely a door there, and it was definitely man-made. In one of the close-up shots, he could see what might be hinges on one side, nearly hidden by corrosion and growth. As the afternoon began to wane, Thomas packed up his gear and began the hike back to his truck. His mind was already planning his return. He would need different equipment, tools to potentially open the door, better lighting, perhaps even recording equipment. And he wouldn't come alone next time. His climbing buddy Pete would be just as intrigued by this discovery. The hike down seemed faster than the journey up, fueled by excitement and the pull of the mystery he'd found. Thomas tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe it was an old storage facility for mining equipment. Perhaps it had been used by the Forest Service for some purpose decades ago. Or maybe it was something more unusual, a research station or even some kind of Cold War bunker. None of these explanations felt quite right, though. The location was too inaccessible, the door too well hidden. Whatever was behind that door, someone had gone to great lengths to keep it secret. When Thomas finally reached his truck, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he drove home, the radio playing softly in the background, his mind kept returning to those strange symbols on the door. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something significant, something that wasn't meant to be found. Casey was waiting when he got home, eager to hear about his climb. Thomas showed her the photos, watching as her expression changed from polite interest to genuine curiosity. "You have to go back," she said after examining the images carefully. "This is wild," Thomas nodded. "I'm thinking next weekend. I'll call Pete tomorrow." That night, as Thomas lay in bed, he found himself unable to sleep. The image of the door kept appearing in his mind. Its weathered surface, the precise lines of its frame, those enigmatic symbols. Something about it tugged at him, a mystery waiting to be solved. What was behind that door in the cliff? And more importantly, who had put it there? Thomas didn't know, but he was determined to find out. He finally drifted off to sleep with one thought circling in his mind. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found. And somehow that made the discovery all the more compelling. Thomas couldn't focus at work all week. His mind kept drifting back to the weathered metal door embedded in the cliff face. During lunch breaks, he'd pull out his phone and scroll through the photos he'd taken, studying every detail. The strange symbols seemed familiar somehow, yet he couldn't place them. By Wednesday, he'd called his climbing buddy Pete 3 times, each conversation more animated than the last. "I'm telling you, this isn't some random thing," Thomas insisted during their latest call. "Someone put a lot of effort into hiding this door." "Could be old mining equipment storage," Pete suggested. Didn't they survey that area back in the day? That's what I thought at first, Thomas replied. But why put it 200 feet up a cliff? And those markings don't look like standard industrial signs. Pete sighed. Well, I'm in for Saturday. But we're bringing proper gear this time, right? I'm not hanging off a cliff trying to pick a lock with my Swiss Army knife. Thomas laughed. Already ordered some tools. They'll be here tomorrow. Casey wasn't as enthusiastic about the return trip. Thursday night, as Thomas spread his new equipment across their living room floor, she watched with a frown. I don't know, Tom. Something about this doesn't feel right. Thomas looked up from the compact pry bar he was examining. What do you mean? If someone went to all that trouble to hide a door in a remote cliff, maybe it's supposed to stay hidden. She picked up one of the photos. These symbols. They look like warnings to me. Thomas hadn't considered that angle. He studied the image more carefully. The markings did have a certain forbidding quality to them, harsh angles and deep cuts into the metal. But his curiosity outweighed any concern. We'll be careful, he promised. Pete's coming and I've got the satellite phone. We're just going to take a look. Saturday morning arrived with perfect climbing weather. Clear skies, mild temperature, light breeze. Thomas and Pete reached the trailhead early, their packs heavier than usual with the extra equipment. So walk me through this again, Pete said as they hiked toward the cliff. You found this door completely by accident? Thomas nodded. I was feeling around for a handhold and touched something too smooth to be natural. You know how it is. You develop a feel for the rock after a while. And no one else has reported finding anything like this. Not that I could find. I checked climbing forums, local history sites, even called the park ranger station. No mention of any structures in that cliff face. They reached the base of the cliff around 9. The climb to the door's location would take about 2 hours at a steady pace. Thomas led the way, retracing his route from the previous week. Despite his excitement, he moved methodically, testing each hold before committing his weight. Pete followed, occasionally whistling low under his breath as they gained altitude. You weren't kidding about how remote this spot is. Great view, though. By 11:30, they were approaching the section where Thomas had made his discovery. He slowed down, scanning the rock face carefully. Should be right around there. Thomas pointed to a patch of lichen and moss about 10 feet to their right. They maneuvered sideways along the cliff until they reached the spot. Thomas anchored himself securely, then began clearing away more of the vegetation that covered the door. With the additional clearing, the outline became more distinct. Pete let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. You weren't exaggerating. The door was exactly as Thomas remembered, roughly 3 feet tall by 2 feet wide, made of some kind of metal that had weathered to nearly the same color as the surrounding stone. Now that more of the growth had been removed, the symbols etched into its surface were even more prominent. Those don't look like any industrial markings I've ever seen, Pete said, leaning closer to examine them. Almost reminds me of those old hobo signs, you know? But more, I don't know, deliberate? Thomas nodded. My thoughts exactly. Not random graffiti. Somebody meant to communicate something specific. They spent several minutes photographing the door from various angles, making sure to document every detail of the markings. Pete had brought a small notebook and sketched some of the symbols as well. No handle, right? Pete asked, running his fingers along the edge of the door. None that I could find. But look here. Thomas pointed to what appeared to be hinges on one side, nearly hidden by corrosion. And there's some kind of mechanism on this side. Maybe a lock? Pete examined the area Thomas indicated. Could be. Hard to tell with all this buildup. Let's clean it up a bit. Using a small brush he'd brought, Pete carefully removed decades of mineral deposits and grime from what did indeed appear to be some kind of locking mechanism. As the details emerged, they could see it wasn't a conventional lock, but rather a complex arrangement of small metal plates. This is weird, Pete muttered. Looks almost like a puzzle. Thomas pulled out his phone and took close-up photos of the newly revealed mechanism. Yeah, like you need to move these plates in a specific pattern. They spent the next hour trying various combinations, carefully shifting the small metal pieces, hoping to trigger whatever release mechanism controlled the door. Sweat dripped down Thomas's back, partly from exertion and partly from the mounting frustration. Let's take a break, Pete suggested eventually. My fingers are getting numb and we're not making progress. They secured themselves to the cliff face and drank some water, looking out at the expansive view. The forest stretched below them, A rich tapestry of green broken only by the occasional rocky outcropping or clearing. Beautiful, isn't it? Thomas said. Pete nodded. Makes you wonder why someone would build something way out here. And why hide it in a cliff face? That's been bugging me too. I've been doing some research on the area's history. There was a small mining operation about 5 miles north of here in the early 1900s. Copper mostly, but it shut down around 1915. You think this could be connected? Thomas shrugged. Maybe. But this door looks more sophisticated than what miners would typically use back then. And those symbols don't match any mining markings I've found in my research. After their break, they returned to the puzzle with fresh eyes. Thomas studied the symbols more carefully, noting how certain patterns repeated. Wait a second, he said suddenly. Look at this sequence here. It's the same as this one on the locking mechanism. Pete leaned in. You're right. Think it's some kind of instruction? Worth a try. Following the pattern indicated by the symbols, Thomas carefully shifted the metal plates. There was a soft click, then another. Something inside the door moved. Holy shit, Pete whispered. I think you got it. With one final adjustment, they heard a more substantial thunk, and the edge of the door shifted slightly outward. It worked. Thomas couldn't keep the excitement from his voice. Help me pull it open. Together, they carefully eased the door outward. It moved reluctantly at first, the hinges protesting after decades of disuse. As it swung open, a rush of stale air escaped from within. Whoa, Pete said, wrinkling his nose. That doesn't smell great. Thomas pulled out his headlamp and shined it into the opening. The beam revealed a narrow tunnel extending back into the cliff. The walls were smooth, clearly man-made, reinforced in places with old timber supports. A thin layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for what must have been years. This is incredible, Thomas breathed. Look at the workmanship on these walls. This wasn't just thrown together. Pete looked uneasy. Tom, I don't know about this. That tunnel could be unstable, and we don't know what's back there. That's why we came, isn't it? To find out? Thomas adjusted his headlamp. We don't have to go far. Just a quick look. After some debate, they agreed on a compromise. They would venture into the tunnel only as far as they could while maintaining visual contact with the doorway. They'd set a strict time limit of 20 minutes, and if they encountered any signs of structural instability, they would retreat immediately. With their safety rules established, Thomas led the way into the tunnel, ducking to avoid the low ceiling. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something chemical that he couldn't identify. The tunnel extended straight back for about 30 feet before making a gentle curve to the right. The floor was surprisingly level, though covered with a fine layer of silt. Here and there they spotted footprints preserved in the dust, clear evidence that others had been here before, though long ago. Look at these, Pete said, crouching to examine one of the prints. These are old. Really old, Thomas nodded. And check this out. He pointed his light at the wall where more symbols had been carved into the stone, similar to those on the door, but more extensive. They photographed everything meticulously, careful not to disturb any more of the dust than necessary. As they approached the bend in the tunnel, the 20-minute mark was drawing near. We should head back soon, Pete reminded him. Just a little further, Thomas urged. Let's see what's around this corner. As they rounded the bend, their lights revealed something unexpected. The tunnel widened into a small chamber, and on the far wall, partially obscured by shadows, was what appeared to be another door, this one larger and more imposing than the first. Time to go, Pete said firmly, checking his watch. We've been in here for 18 minutes already. Thomas wanted to protest, to push just a little further, but he knew Pete was right. They had what they came for. Confirmation that the door led somewhere significant, photos of the tunnel and its markings, and the knowledge that there was more to discover. All right, he agreed reluctantly, but we're coming back. With better gear. As they made their way back to the entrance, Thomas's mind raced with questions. Who had built this place? When? And most importantly, what was behind that second door? They emerged into the sunlight, blinking as their eyes readjusted. Carefully, they pulled the door closed behind them, feeling the locking mechanism re-engage with a solid click. No one would believe this without evidence, Pete said as they began their descent. Thomas nodded, already planning their return. That second door. Did you notice it was different? Newer somehow. Yeah, and those symbols changed too. The ones deeper in seemed more, urgent, As they climbed down, both men were quieter than usual, lost in their own thoughts about what they'd discovered. Thomas knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't rest until he knew what lay beyond that second door. The mystery had only deepened, pulling him in further, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Casey's words echoed. If someone went to all that trouble to hide a door in a remote cliff, maybe it's supposed to stay hidden. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tunnel stretching into darkness, the mysterious symbols on the walls, and that second door waiting to be opened. By morning, he had made up his mind. He needed to learn more about those symbols before going back to the cliff. Over breakfast, he showed Casey the new photos. Her frown deepened as she swiped through them. "You actually went inside?" she asked, her coffee forgotten. "Tom, this is getting weird. I know it sounds crazy, but you should have seen it." The tunnel was man-made, really well constructed. Someone put serious work into this place. He pointed to one of the images. And these markings were all over the walls, similar to the ones on the door, but more complex. Casey studied the photo. "Have you shown these to anyone who might know what they mean?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet. I was thinking about reaching out to Dr. Hendricks at the university. She teaches archaeology and specializes in Native American symbols." "That's a good idea," Casey said, seeming relieved that he was being cautious. "Just promise me you won't go back there until you know more about what you're dealing with." Thomas hesitated before nodding. "I promise." Monday afternoon, Thomas sat in Dr. Hendricks's cluttered office, watching as the professor examined his photos with growing interest. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that missed nothing. "Where did you say you found these?" she asked, looking up sharply. "On a climbing trip in the Cascades," Thomas replied, deliberately vague. Something about her intense reaction made him cautious. Dr. Hendricks nodded slowly. "These aren't Native American symbols, at least not primarily. There are some elements that resemble Salish pictographs, but they've been combined with something else." She pointed to a recurring pattern. "This sequence here appears to be some kind of warning or restriction." "Warning about what?" "That's the interesting part. I've seen similar markings documented in historical records. From mining operations in the early 1900s, they were used by a very specific group, a mining consortium that operated under the name Westward Resources Limited." Thomas leaned forward. "What's special about this company?" "They were secretive, for one thing, and they had some unusual practices." Dr. Hendricks pulled a book from her shelf and flipped to a dog-eared page. "Here, this is from a historian's account of mining operations in the Pacific Northwest. Westward Resources was rumored to have developed their own system of symbols to mark their sites. They also had a reputation for choosing remote locations and employing unusual security measures." Thomas studied the page she showed him, which included rough sketches of symbols remarkably similar to those he'd photographed. "Do you know why they were so secretive?" Dr. Hendricks closed the book. "There were rumors they were mining more than just copper and silver. Some accounts suggest they found something else, something they didn't want competitors to know about." She hesitated. "There were also stories about miners disappearing in their operations. Several men went missing in 1915, and shortly after, Westward Resources ceased all operations in the region." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you think they found?" "I couldn't say. The historical record is frustratingly vague." She looked at him intently. "Mr. Chen, if you've discovered one of their sites, you should be careful. Some of these old mining tunnels can be dangerous. Unstable supports, pockets of bad air, that sort of thing." Thomas thanked her for her time and left with more questions than answers. On his drive home, he called Pete to share what he'd learned. "So we've got a secretive mining company, missing workers and weird symbols," Pete summarized. "This is starting to sound like the setup for a horror movie, Tom." I know. "But aren't you curious? What if they found something valuable? Something worth hiding behind 2 locked doors in a cliff face?" Pete was silent for a moment. "When are we going back?" "This weekend. But we need better gear this time. Proper air quality monitors, better lights, maybe even a small camera we can send ahead if there are tight spaces." "I can borrow some equipment from work," Pete offered. He worked as an environmental inspector and had access to monitoring devices. "But Tom?" "This time we bring someone else too. A third person who stays outside, knows exactly where we are, and can call for help if we don't come back on schedule." Thomas agreed, and they spent the rest of the week gathering equipment and making plans. Casey reluctantly agreed to be their safety contact, though she made it clear she thought they were taking an unnecessary risk. By Saturday morning, Thomas and Pete had assembled an impressive array of gear. Air quality monitors, better headlamps, a small inspection camera on a flexible cable, proper respirators in case they encountered dust or mold, and even a portable two-way radio system that might work through the rock. The climb up went faster this time. Both men familiar with the route and eager to reach their destination. They found the door exactly as they'd left it, still hidden from casual observation by the surrounding vegetation. This time, the locking mechanism yielded more easily to their manipulations, perhaps loosened by their previous visit. As the door swung open, Pete set up a small device next to it. Motion sensor, he explained. If anyone else comes while we're inside, we'll know. They adjusted their headlamps and respirators, then Thomas radioed Casey to let her know they were entering the tunnel. They'd agreed to check in every 30 minutes. And if Casey didn't hear from them for over an hour, she would call the emergency number for the ranger station. The tunnel looked just as Thomas remembered. Narrow, sloping slightly downward, with timber supports at regular intervals. The air quality monitor showed normal readings, though the air was stale. Their footprints from the previous visit were still visible in the dust. They moved more confidently this time, documenting everything with photos and occasional notes. Thomas pointed out additional symbols they'd missed on their first visit, smaller markings etched at junction points in the tunnel ceiling. These almost look like directional indicators, Pete said, photographing one, like they're marking a path. As they approached the bend in the tunnel, Thomas felt his heart rate increase. The chamber with the second door awaited them just around the corner. This time they were prepared to investigate it properly. The chamber was larger than Thomas remembered, roughly 15 feet across and 10 feet high. Unlike the tunnel, which had been reinforced with timber, this space had been fully lined with fitted stone blocks, the workmanship surprisingly sophisticated for what was supposed to be a mining operation. The second door dominated the far wall, a massive steel construct with a circular wheel in its center. Like a bank vault door, more symbols covered its surface, arranged in concentric circles around the central wheel. Unlike the outer door, this one showed less corrosion, its metal still holding a dull sheen in the beam of their headlamps. "This doesn't look like mining equipment," Pete whispered. His voice hushed in the enclosed space. Thomas approached the door slowly, studying the symbols. Some matched those they'd seen before, but others were new, more complex arrangements of lines and angles. Along the door's edge ran a series of small metal plates, each etched with what appeared to be numbers. "Look at this," Thomas said, pointing to the numbered plates. "Some kind of combination lock?" Pete checked the air quality monitor again. "Readings are still normal, but let's keep these respirators on. No telling what might be disturbed if we get this door open." They spent several minutes examining the door, taking photos and discussing possible approaches. The central wheel wouldn't turn, apparently locked in place by the combination mechanism. Thomas studied the symbols, looking for patterns similar to what had worked on the outer door. "These circular arrangements," he said finally, "they remind me of clock faces. What if the numbers are meant to be set in a specific sequence, like time settings?" Pete looked skeptical but willing to try. "Any ideas on what the sequence might be?" Thomas traced one of the symbol circles. "This pattern repeats 4 times around the circle, but with slight variations. Maybe 4 different number settings?" Through trial and error, they began testing different combinations, carefully turning the numbered plates. On their third attempt, something clicked inside the door mechanism. Encouraged, they continued, following the pattern Thomas had identified. When the final plate clicked into place, the central wheel loosened. It took both of them pushing together to turn it. The door's locking bolts retracted with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the stone chamber. "Should we radio Casey before we go further?" Pete asked, glancing at his watch. Thomas checked the time. "We're due to check in about 5 minutes anyway. Let's do it now." He pressed the radio button. "Casey, we've made it to the inner chamber and managed to unlock the second door. We're about to open it. Everything's fine so far. Air quality is good." Casey's voice came back, distorted but understandable. "Be careful. What's your timeline looking like?" "We'll explore for 30 minutes maximum, then start heading back. Next check-in will be in 30 minutes or sooner if we find anything significant." "Copy that." Be safe. With that done, they turned back to the door. Together, they pulled on the central wheel and slowly, grudgingly, the heavy door began to swing outward. As it opened, a different smell reached them even through their respirators. The sharp, chemical odor. Thomas had noticed faintly on their first visit. But stronger now, the air quality monitor beeped, showing elevated levels of something it couldn't precisely identify. Not immediately dangerous, Pete said, studying the readings. But I wouldn't want to breathe this for long. Good thing we brought these masks. They shined their lights through the doorway. Beyond lay not another tunnel, but a large cavern, clearly natural in origin but modified by human hands. Metal catwalks extended from the doorway across the uneven floor, and electrical conduit ran along the walls. Long dead, but evidence of significant infrastructure. Their lights couldn't reach the far end of the cavern, but they could make out shapes in the darkness. Large pieces of equipment covered in tarps, workbenches along one wall, and what appeared to be filing cabinets or storage containers arranged in neat rows. This is no mining operation. Pete breathed. At least not a conventional one. This looks more like a research facility, Thomas finished for him, or a lab of some kind. They stepped cautiously onto the catwalk, testing it for stability before proceeding. The metal creaked but held firm. As they advanced into the cavern, more details emerged from the darkness. Overhead, a complex system of pipes ran across the ceiling. To their right, a separate area had been partitioned off with glass walls, creating what looked like observation rooms or offices. Tom, Pete said suddenly, his voice tight. Look at those containers against the far wall. Thomas directed his light where Pete indicated. Along the back of the cavern stood a row of large metal cylinders, each marked with faded hazard symbols and dates. Even from a distance, they could make out some of the labels. 1943, 1944, 1945. Those aren't from 1915, Thomas said. This place was used much later than the mining operation Dr. Hendricks told me about. They continued forward, drawn by the mystery despite the growing sense of unease. As they neared the center of the cavern, their lights fell on a metal desk with papers still scattered across its surface. Preserved in the dry air of the sealed space, Thomas picked up one of the documents carefully. The letterhead bore an eagle symbol and the words, War Department Classified. The date at the top read April 12, 1944. Pete, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think we just found a secret government facility from World War II. Pete leaned over to see the document, his face pale in the harsh light of the headlamp. We need to report this. This is way beyond two guys with climbing gear. Thomas nodded slowly, a chill running through him as he realized what they'd stumbled upon. Let's take some photos for documentation, then get out of here. As they began photographing the space, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they'd opened a door that was meant to stay, firmly closed, and that whatever had happened in this hidden facility half a century ago might have been buried for a very good reason. Thomas and Pete worked quickly, documenting the abandoned facility with careful photographs. Neither spoke much as they moved through the space, the magnitude of their discovery weighing heavily on them. The air quality monitor beeped occasionally, reminding them not to linger too long. Look at this, Pete called, shining his light on what appeared to be a laboratory setup. Glass beakers and test tubes sat on dusty workbenches, some still containing dried residue of whatever experiments had been conducted here decades ago. Thomas photographed everything, then moved to a row of filing cabinets along one wall. Most were locked, but one drawer stood partially open. He pulled it out carefully, revealing manila folders with faded labels. Project Nightshade, Thomas read aloud, pulling out one folder. Inside were typewritten pages filled with chemical formulas and observation notes. Many sections had been redacted with thick black lines, but enough remained to be disturbing. Subject exhibited symptoms within 4 hours of exposure, he read, his voice growing quieter. Disorientation followed by respiratory distress. Pete looked over his shoulder. Put that back, Tom. Whatever they were doing here, it doesn't sound good. Thomas nodded grimly, replacing the folder. He picked up another document that had been sitting on top of the cabinet, this one bearing the same War Department letterhead they'd seen earlier. Listen to this, he said. Containment protocols must be strictly observed. Any personnel exhibiting symptoms are to be quarantined immediately. Contamination of the local watershed must be avoided at all costs. Pete, they were testing something dangerous here. Pete checked his watch. We need to radio Casey and then get out. This is way above our pay grade. Thomas agreed, reaching for the radio. Casey, do you copy? We've found something serious here. Looks like this was a government testing facility from World War II. There are hazardous materials warnings everywhere. The radio crackled with static, Casey's voice coming through broken but understandable. Get out now, someone. Casey, you're breaking up. Say again. Thomas adjusted the radio, but the signal seemed to be weakening. Not alone. Vehicle at trailhead. Thomas and Pete exchanged concerned looks. Is she saying there's someone else at the trailhead? Pete asked. Casey, if you can hear us, we're heading out now. We'll be back at the trailhead in about 3 hours. Over. Thomas waited, but there was no response. Just more static. Could be the rock interfering with the signal. Pete suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Either way, we should go. I don't like what I'm seeing on this monitor. Those containers might be leaking something. They took a few final photographs, then made their way back to the vault door. As they pulled it closed behind them, Thomas noticed something they'd missed earlier. A small plaque on the inner side of the door with a faded radiation warning symbol. Pete. Look, Thomas pointed at the symbol. You think they were working with radioactive materials? Pete checked his monitor again. This thing isn't designed to detect radiation, but it would explain the containment measures. He hesitated. Tom, if there is radiation in there, we've been exposed. Not for long, though, Thomas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. And those containers looked intact. Let's just get out of here and report this to the proper authorities. They sealed the vault door, making sure the locking mechanism re-engaged. As they moved through the outer tunnel toward daylight, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were carrying something dangerous out with them. Not physically, but knowledge that wasn't meant to be found. When they finally emerged from the cliff door into the afternoon sunlight, both men breathed deeply, grateful for the fresh air. They carefully closed the outer door as well, ensuring it blended back into the rock face as they'd found it. The descent went quickly, both men eager to get back to the trailhead and find out what Casey had been trying to tell them. As they neared the bottom of the cliff, Thomas spotted movement in the trees below. Someone's down there, he whispered, pointing. Pete squinted. Hikers, maybe? But as they continued their descent, they could see a man in a dark jacket moving purposefully along the trail. Not a casual hiker, but someone who seemed to be searching for something. Or someone. Let's keep our distance, Thomas suggested. Head down the east side instead of the main trail. It's rougher terrain, but will be less visible. They altered their route, taking a steeper, less traveled path down the mountainside. The detour added almost an hour to their descent, but they saw no more signs of the stranger. By the time they approached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to set. Thomas spotted Casey's blue hatchback right away, parked where they'd left it that morning. Casey was sitting inside looking tense. Parked next to her was a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. This doesn't look good, Pete muttered. They approached cautiously. When Casey saw them, relief flooded her face. She stepped out of her car and hurried over. Where have you been? She hissed. I've been worried sick. These people showed up about 2 hours ago asking questions. What people? Thomas asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Casey nodded toward the SUV. Government types. They asked if I was waiting for someone, how long I'd been here, if I knew anything about climbing activities in the area. I played dumb, said I was just enjoying nature and reading my book. Did they believe you? I don't know. They've been sitting there watching. One of them went up the trail for a while but came back maybe 20 minutes ago. Thomas looked over at the SUV. Through the windshield, he could make out 2 figures in the front seats. We need to get out of here without looking suspicious. And go where? Pete asked. If they're government, they probably already have our names from the trail register. And we still need to report what we found up there. Thomas rubbed his face, trying to think. You're right. But I want to do it on our terms, not get black-bagged in a parking lot. Casey looked back and forth between them. Will someone please tell me what's going on? What did you find up there? Not here, Thomas said. Let's get in your car and head out. Act normal, like we just finished a regular hike. We'll tell you everything once we're away from here. They loaded their gear into Casey's car, trying to appear casual. Thomas felt eyes on them the entire time. As they pulled out of the parking area, he watched the SUV in the side mirror. It didn't follow immediately, but he had no doubt they were being watched. Once they were back on the main road, Casey demanded answers. Thomas and Pete took turns explaining what they'd found: the hidden facility, the classified documents, the warning labels, and the containment protocols. "This is crazy," Casey said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You guys stumbled onto some kind of secret government testing site from World War II, and now there are mysterious agents at the trailhead? This is like something from a movie. Except it's real," Pete said grimly. "And those containers we saw could be leaking who knows what into the groundwater." "We need to report this." "To who?" Casey asked. "Clearly the government already knows about it. Maybe those people at the trailhead are there to keep it secret?" Thomas shook his head. "Not necessarily. They might monitor the area routinely, and we just triggered some kind of alert by being there too long, or someone could have spotted us on the cliff." They decided to drive to Pete's house to regroup and figure out their next steps. As they pulled into his driveway, Thomas noticed a sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there when they left that morning. Inside, Pete immediately turned on his laptop. "I'm going to check these photos, see if we can identify exactly what kind of facility this was." While he worked, Thomas called Dr. Hendricks at the university, hoping she might shed more light on what they'd discovered. To his surprise, she agreed to meet them that evening. An hour later, they sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near the campus. Dr. Hendricks examined their photos with increasing concern. "This goes well beyond Westward Resources," she said finally. "The mining operation must have been a cover for this facility." She pointed to one of the documents they'd photographed. "This mentions Project Nightshade. I've heard rumors about this." "What kind of rumors?" Casey asked. Dr. Hendricks lowered her voice. "During World War II, the government established several classified research sites for chemical and biological weapons development. Most were in remote locations hidden from public view. Project Nightshade was supposedly one of the most secretive. There are almost no official records of its existence." "What were they working on?" Thomas asked. "According to what little information exists, they were developing chemical agents for possible use in the Pacific Theater, compounds that could be deployed in jungle environments." She tapped one of the photos showing the dated containers. "These would have been stored samples, and based on these warning labels, extremely dangerous ones." Pete leaned forward. "We need to report this to the EPA or something." "If those containers are degrading," Dr. Hendricks nodded. "I have a former student who works for the State Environmental Protection Division. We can trust her to take this seriously without immediately calling in federal agents." As they discussed next steps, Thomas noticed a man enter the coffee shop, the same dark jacket he'd spotted on the trail earlier. The man didn't look their way but ordered a coffee and took a seat by the door. "Don't look now," Thomas said quietly, "but I think we're being followed." Dr. Hendricks didn't seem surprised. These old sites are still classified even decades later. Someone doesn't want this getting out. She slipped the photos into her bag. "I'll contact my former student tonight. In the meantime, be careful. Don't discuss this on phones or email." They left separately with Dr. Hendricks taking the photos. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They'd passed the responsibility to someone better equipped to handle it. But as he drove home with Casey, the sedan they'd noticed earlier appeared in his rearview mirror. "We're definitely being followed," he said quietly. Casey gripped his arm. "Tom, I'm scared. What if they think we're going to expose some dirty government secret?" "That's exactly what we're doing," Thomas replied. "But it's the right thing to do. Those containers could be leaking into the watershed. People could be getting sick without knowing why." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the facility hidden in the cliff, the classified documents, the warning symbols. Whatever Project Nightshade had been working on, it had been dangerous enough to hide deep in a remote mountainside. And now, decades later, it might be silently poisoning the surrounding environment. His phone buzzed with a text from Pete. "Check the news tomorrow. Dr. H's contact is moving fast." Thomas put down his phone and went to the window. The sedan was still parked across the street, its occupant invisible behind tinted windows. He knew their discovery was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to the time before they found that hidden door in the cliff. Thomas woke to his phone buzzing insistently. It was Pete calling at 6:30 in the morning. "Turn on the news," Pete said without preamble. "Channel 4. Thomas fumbled for the remote, Casey stirring beside him. The local morning news was showing footage of emergency vehicles and workers in hazmat suits gathered at a familiar trailhead. Environmental emergency has been declared in the Cascade Mountain region, the reporter was saying. State officials received an anonymous tip about potentially hazardous materials hidden in a remote location. Initial testing has confirmed the presence of several dangerous chemical compounds in the soil and nearby water. Sources. Thomas and Casey watched in stunned silence as the camera panned to show more emergency response teams arriving, some carrying specialized equipment for handling hazardous materials. Dr. Hendrick's contact came through, Pete said over the phone. They moved fast. Are those the people from yesterday? Casey asked, pointing to men in dark suits standing apart from the emergency workers, talking into radios. The reporter continued. Officials are not commenting on the nature or origin of these chemicals, but sources tell us the contamination may be linked to classified government operations dating back to World War II. Residents in downstream communities are being advised to avoid using well water until further notice. Thomas felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They're actually doing something about it. Yeah, but look who else is there, Pete replied. Those aren't just EPA guys. That's damage control. As if confirming his words, the camera briefly showed workers erecting screens around the trail entrance, blocking the view of whatever was happening beyond. The question is, Pete continued, what happens to us now? We're the ones who found this place. Thomas looked out his window. The sedan was gone from across the street, but that didn't make him feel any better. Let's meet at your place in an hour. Bring your laptop and anything else with information about what we found. I think we need to be prepared for visitors. Sure enough, as Thomas and Casey pulled into Pete's driveway an hour later, a black SUV with government plates was already parked outside. Two men in suits stood on the porch talking with Pete. Here we go, Thomas muttered, squeezing Casey's hand before stepping out of the car. One of the men turned as they approached. Mr. Chen? I'm Agent Wilson, Department of Defense. We'd like to ask you some questions about your recent climbing activity. Thomas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. I figured you might. Inside, they sat around Pete's dining table. Agent Wilson and his partner, Agent Reyes, were polite but direct. We understand you discovered a sealed facility in the cliff face, Wilson began. We need to know exactly what you saw inside, what you touched, and what documentation you might have taken. Thomas exchanged glances with Pete before answering. We found what appeared to be a World War II-era research facility. There were chemical storage containers, lab equipment, and some paperwork mentioning Project Nightshade. We took photographs, but no physical items. And where are these photographs now? Reyes asked. We shared them with Dr. Hendricks at the university, Pete said. She's the one who contacted the environmental authorities. Wilson nodded, unsurprised. We've already spoken with Dr. Hendricks. She's been cooperative. Are we in trouble? Casey asked bluntly. Wilson almost smiled. No, Ms. Ramsey. Technically, you trespassed on a restricted government site, but there were no visible markings indicating its status. Our main concern is public safety and containment of both the physical hazards and the information. What kind of hazards are we talking about? Thomas asked. Those containers looked old. If they've been leaking, Reyes and Wilson exchanged looks. That's why we're here, Reyes said. We need to assess your potential exposure. The facility was used to develop chemical agents during World War II, mostly tear gas variants and experimental defoliants. Some of these compounds break down into harmful substances over time. Thomas felt a chill run through him. Are you saying we were exposed to something dangerous? It's a possibility we need to rule out, Wilson replied. We have a medical team waiting to conduct evaluations. Standard procedure in cases like this. Cases like this? Pete repeated.
How often do people stumble onto secret government chemical weapons dumps?
More often than you might think, Wilson said grimly. The rush to develop weapons during the war led to hundreds of remote testing and storage facilities. Many were improperly decommissioned or simply abandoned when the war ended. We've been locating and cleaning them up for decades. And keeping it all secret, Thomas added. Wilson nodded. National security concerns primarily. But in this case, the contamination risk outweighs those concerns. They agreed to go with the agents to a mobile medical unit that had been set up near the trailhead. As they drove behind the government SUV, Casey voiced what they were all thinking. Do you think they're telling us everything? About what was in that facility? Thomas shook his head. Probably not, but they seemed genuinely concerned about the environmental impact, which matches what we saw. The trailhead had been transformed since yesterday. A dozen vehicles were parked in the small lot, including several trucks with hazardous materials handling equipment. Workers in protective suits moved purposefully around the area, and a perimeter of yellow caution tape kept onlookers at bay. In a white medical tent, doctors in military uniforms conducted thorough examinations. Blood samples were drawn, lung capacity measured, reflexes tested. Thomas and his friends answered detailed questions about their time in the facility, how long they were inside, what they touched, whether they noticed any unusual symptoms afterward. Your preliminary results look normal, the doctor told Thomas after completing his examination, but we'll want to do follow-up testing in a few days. Some exposure effects can take time to manifest. As they waited for Pete to finish his examination, Thomas noticed Dr. Hendricks speaking with a woman in an EPA jacket near one of the command vehicles. When she saw him, she came over. "I'm sorry for the circus," she said, gesturing at the activity around them. "But when I showed them the photos, they mobilized immediately. Whatever was in those containers, it's bad enough to warrant all this. Have they told you anything more about what this place was?" Thomas asked. Dr. Hendricks lowered her voice. "Not officially, but my contact at the EPA says they've detected compounds consistent with experimental chemical weapons development. Apparently the facility was part of a program exploring chemicals that could be deployed in jungle environments in the Pacific. Theater, things that would penetrate dense vegetation or remain active in high humidity. And they just left it all here when they finished? That's the disturbing part," she replied. "According to what little documentation they've found, the facility was supposed to be properly decommissioned in 1946. All materials were to be removed, and the entrance permanently sealed. Obviously, that didn't happen correctly." Thomas watched as workers carried specialized containment units toward the trail. "What happens now?" "Full remediation," Dr. Hendricks said. "They'll remove every container, test the surrounding soil and water, and install monitoring equipment. It's going to be a major operation, possibly lasting months." Later that afternoon, after being cleared by the medical team with instructions to return for follow-up tests, Thomas, Casey, and Pete stood at the edge of the parking area, watching the activity. "I can't believe it was just sitting there all this time," Pete said. "Right above hiking trails feeding into streams people fish in." Agent Wilson approached them, holding a folder. "We have some paperwork for you to sign, confidentiality agreements regarding certain aspects of what you saw inside the facility." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Still trying to keep secrets?" Wilson shook his head. "The environmental situation will be public. The exact nature and purpose of Project Nightshade remains classified. Standard protocol. And if we don't sign?" Casey asked. "Then we have a different conversation," Wilson replied, his tone still pleasant but with an edge of steel beneath. "One involving national security laws. They signed the papers which prohibited them from discussing specific details about the facility's contents or any documents they had seen inside. The environmental contamination, however, was not covered by the agreement." "One more thing," Wilson said as they prepared to leave. "We've reviewed the climbing forums. Several people have noted that unusual rock formation and plan to explore it. Your discovery was likely inevitable. Better now than 10 years from now." Thomas wasn't sure if that was meant to make them feel better or not. 2 weeks later, Thomas sat in his living room watching the evening news. The discovery of the legacy contamination site had become a major story. Environmental groups were demanding accountability. Local officials were assuring residents that water testing was ongoing, and historians were piecing together the forgotten history of secret military operations in the region. No one mentioned Project Nightshade by name, and the news never showed images of the facility's interior, just the cliff face and the remediation efforts at its base. Thomas recognized the careful management of information, but the important part was happening. The dangerous chemicals were being removed, the watershed protected. His phone buzzed with a text from Pete. "Check your email. Dr. H sent something interesting." The email contained a newspaper clipping from 1946, detailing the mysterious deaths of 3 government contractors involved in a classified decommissioning operation in the mountains. The cause had been listed as equipment accident, but Dr. Hendricks had added a note. "Sound familiar? History gets buried, but the truth finds a way out eventually." Casey looked over his shoulder at the article. You still glad you found that door in the cliff? Thomas thought for a moment. Yeah, I am. Think about how much longer those chemicals could have leaked if nobody found them. True, Casey agreed. Though I could have done without the government surveillance and potential toxic exposure. Thomas smiled. Next time, we'll stick to well-documented climbing routes. Next time? Casey rolled her eyes, but she was smiling too. Later that night, as Thomas stood at the window looking out at the quiet street, he reflected on how a simple climbing trip had turned into something so much bigger. The hidden door had led not just to a physical discovery, but to buried history, environmental danger, and ultimately, a kind of justice for the land and communities that had been silently threatened for decades. Some doors, once opened, changed everything that came after. This one certainly had, and despite the danger and complications, Thomas couldn't regret being the one who found it.